Schneid guy.
So now we're going to talk about the nephron structure. And so what I have shown here are two different kinds of nephrons. Let's start with this nephron over here, and we see there's Bowman's capsule, which has Bowman's space inside. And then the first nephron segment is the proximal tubule, labeled here all the way up to about here. Now, the proximal tubule does have some convolutions, and it twists a bit and then has a straight part. Sometimes people call the proximal tubule the proximal convoluted tubule. We're just going to call it the proximal tubule for simplicity. After the proximal tubule, we now have this structure here called the thin descending limb. It's the first part of what we call Henle's loop, or the loop of Henle. And this goes down and has a hairpin turn. And the first part coming back up is the thin ascending limb. And now, as you can see, drawn a little thicker, is the thick ascending limb. So in this first nephron, the loop of Henle would be made up of these three parts: the thin descending, thin ascending, and thick ascending loop. Also notice that there's a region that is adjacent to Bowman's capsule, and I don't have shown here, but there is the blood supply that comes in, and the glomerulus would be right here with the afferent arteriole, and this is in very close proximity. These macula densa cells are thick ascending limb cells that have been specialized to send special signals to the afferent arteriole to regulate renin secretion as well as glomerular filtration, and we'll talk about that in another video. Next, we have the distal tubule, sometimes called the distal convoluted tubule, and then that blends into another distal tubule of another nephron, several nephrons, and they collect their fluid, and this structure here is called the collecting duct, which eventually goes and delivers that fluid to the bladder. Now, notice that this other nephron has also Bowman's capsule, a proximal tubule, thin descending limb. It doesn't have a thin ascending limb, and what I don't have shown here, but I'll label now, is there is also a macula densa region, which is adjacent to the glomerulus and the afferent arterial apparatus, and that then has a distal tubule that, like we said, blends into the collecting duct. Notice that the outer portion of the interstitial space we call the cortex, and the deeper part, the medulla, kind of like we've seen in other anatomical histological discussions. For example, the adrenal medulla, the inner part of the adrenal gland, the adrenal cortex, the outer part. These same terminologies are used throughout anatomy and histology. So this nephron, this one that's longer, is referred to as the juxtamedullary nephron because it goes down deep into the medulla, whereas this nephron is referred to more as a cortical nephron. The juxtamedullary nephrons can have a much higher capability to concentrate the urine, and so if you have a higher proportion of juxtamedullary nephrons, you have a better capacity to concentrate your urine, conserve water. And this explains some differences between species and their ability to concentrate their urine and survive environments where there's very little water. In general, in humans, we have about 15% juxtamedullary nephrons and about 85% cortical nephrons, and that differs between species. Also, just to summarize, the renal corpuscle is a term that's used to describe the glomerulus and Bowman's capsule. Again, the glomerulus was not shown in this discussion, and that engages in glomerular filtration. Now we talk about the tubules as we were going through them, and these are polarized epithelial cells that have very different transporters, tightness of their tight junctions, and because of that, there's different segments do different modifications of this composition of the tubular fluid, and we'll discuss that when we go into the individual nephron segments. And the three main regions are the proximal tubule, that's the first part, the loop of Henle, which is made up of thin descending limb, thick ascending limb always, and if you're a juxtamedullary nephron, you have a thin ascending limb. And we can call the remaining part after the macula densa the distal nephron, which is first the distal tubule and finally the collecting duct.